Thanks so much, Zianda, and it must say it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I've never spoken in such a cool venue before. You guys may not be as good at drinking as my alma mater, Rhodes, but this is the best reception that I've had at a university, speaking in a cinema complete with lovely live music as entree outside, and I've already been fed lots of alcohol by Matthew, so I'm comfortably tipsy as well, but I promise you I'm still very lucid. And it's a fabulous space to be in. It's one of the campuses in South Africa that I think make for the perfect setting to be talking about the issues that we will be talking about this evening. And I will speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then I want us to have the discussion. And please feel free to ask questions. I was always scared that if I come to campus tours around the country, as I've been doing for the last 2 months, that the kind of person who tends to come to my talks already self-select and tend to be the converted, as it were. And I hope that you will feel comfortable to disagree with me and not just to agree with me. Of course, if you think I'm talking the gospel according to Eusebius, feel free to not deliberately be contrarian, but I want you to also feel comfortable in agreeing and disagreeing with me. I want to start really by telling you 4 stories, and they're based on a chapter of my book that's forthcoming in September. My book's called Ubuntu in My Bathroom, and it is a collection of essays, very provocative essays, on race, sexuality, and culture. 18 essays, unpublished, full essays, not just column-length articles. And it's my attempt really, I guess, on the one hand, to make philosophy relevant to public life in South Africa, but also to try and share personal stories and try and draw people into my academic discipline, which is philosophy and specifically ethics. So tonight's talk is actually based on one of the chapters in that book. The second essay in the book is called Racial Baggage in 4-Part Harmony. And that's what I really want to talk about tonight. I want to make a case for saying that really in South Africa, in our personal lives, we have a massive problem insofar as many of us, firstly, do not acknowledge the extent of our own racial baggage. And secondly, many of us who do acknowledge it are unaware of the nature and the scope of the challenge in our personal lives, let alone our interpersonal relations with fellow South Africans. That is the basic thesis of that chapter in my book. And what I will add tonight, which has nothing to do with the book, I want to look at the implications for politics, which is the third leg of tonight's theme of race, identity, and politics. Because I think that a lot of our issues in our own lives and in our interpersonal relations around race and identity have negative analogues when it comes to political discourse in South Africa, both within each of our 2 main parties, but also in terms of political discourse as you might find it on the airwaves, talk shows, letters pages, on social media platform. And that's what I will conclude with before opening up for questions. The first story really is a couple of days ago, I was sitting at Nino's in Rosebank Mall in Johannesburg, trying very hard to get rid of my writer's block for one of my essays for this book, which has to go to the publishers very soon. And while waiting for Godot to come into my life as a writer, I was overlooking the parking lot, and I saw 2 ladies quarreling with each other, and I realized within seconds that obviously the one had bumped the other. I'm not sure whose fault it was, and I couldn't hear the conversation, but it was quite animated, and it sort of got worse as the conversation went on. They looked like they were exchanging numbers, so obviously one had promised the other that the insurance would probably pay out, but the animosity between them was great, and clearly they were becoming more adversarial. One was Indian and one was black, and I found myself thinking, I hope that the black chick is going to give her a nice fat clap. And I was egging on in my head the black woman to be the one to come out of that conversation, the victor, as it were, as if I was watching a boxing match. So I instantly had this racial affinity with the black person, even though for all I know, the black person could have been the arsehole. She could have been the one who had said something that solicited, rightly so, from the Indian lady, a defensive response. I had no clue what the content of their conversation was. I was from a distance. But all I know is I was hoping that the Indian lady would come out worse for wear and not the black girl. Okay? I want you to park that story. That's one story that stuck with me for minutes and for hours after I had the realization that the sole basis of my affinity as I was looking at these two people quarreling is the fact that the one looked a little bit more like me than the other one. A second story I want to share with you is many years ago I developed a friendship with a good friend of mine who was a fellow debater at Rhodes University. We became close friends, who now lives in England, Seth. And years after Seth and I became friends, Seth is white, he said to me one night over a couple of pints of Castle Lager at the Rat and Parrot in Grahamstown. It's a good place to get drunk and have a deep and meaningful conversation. All the debaters who've been to Rhodes are nodding in the audience. And Seth said to me, do you know Hubie, which is my nickname? I have to confess, the first time I met you, I thought, oh my God, I've been given the incompetent black tutor. Because he had met me as a first-year student at Rhodes, walking into my tutorial, and I was his philosophy tutor. And I laughed it off. Obviously, your friendship has got to be as solid as a politician's skull for that kind of confession. But it was clear. My skin color as a black person was supposed to convey mimetically information about me. And in this instance, the information it conveyed was incompetent until proven otherwise. But if you're a white tutor, your white skin conveys a different message, competent until proven useless. Those are the default information traits that are supposed to come with your skin color. And it probably is true of the prejudices within each of our race groups. In other words, I'm sure many of my black tutors also thought, oh my God. So it's not even restricted to cross-racial judgment. And so I wasn't surprised, because both him and I knew that he obviously had walked a sufficient journey to be able to now relate the story as what he first thought of me. And clearly, in his case, I'd managed to defeat his assumptions of being useless. And now we're very close friends. So that's the second story. The third story I want to share with you is when I arrived at Oxford University, I immediately joined the Oxford Debate Union. Because I'm a competitive debater, and the Oxford Debate Union is a very difficult, challenging debating chamber, probably the best in the world. And you have presidents, the who's who of politics, famous men and women come and go, and quite frankly, it's the one debating society in the world where people would pay, flying themselves there at their own expense to come and speak. You don't even have to put up all their logistical costs and arrangements. That's how prestigious the invitation is to speak in the chamber. But it's not an easy space because the students are ferocious. They offer you very tough points of information and questions and paper speeches from the floor. So you really got to know your stuff if you want to speak there. And during my first term, I went there, and I can't remember what the topic was, but one of the speakers were a black gentleman, and it was his turn to speak, and the debate had been going very well. And as he stood up and he walked towards the podium, I found myself holding my thumbs. And I thought, please don't fuck up. I hope you will do very well, because you are about to represent every single black person. It was only weeks later that I thought about that and realized how strange it is. This guy was a stranger. I can't even remember his name. He had no connection with me. The only connection is that he was black and that I self-identify as black. But I didn't care how the white speakers before him were about to perform. And yet I, in my head, wanted him to speak so well that he could get a 2-minute standing ovation and a massive round of applause that eclipses that which any of the other speakers had received. But the only basis of egging him on to do well was the fact that him and I shared the random trait of both being black. And that sat with me for quite a while, because it was clear to me that it is a reflection on just how deep racial affinities run in South Africans. I wasn't sure whether that was the exception or whether that was typical, but it struck me that it's both irrational but a trope in my response to seeing people walk towards podiums that I've always had. And it didn't end there, by the way. I thought when I wrote this particular chapter of my book recently that maybe that's something I felt years ago, and now, like all of you, we're walking towards a racial nirvana where I couldn't possibly still respond like that to skin color. But then I realized, of course, it's not true. One example is the two ladies who were having a brawl. There was a variation on what I felt towards the speaker at Oxford. But I also feel it in other areas of my life. I mean, you know, I'm not a big rugby supporter. I do want the national team to do well. But I must say that part of my desire with Peter de Villiers was that he should do well because he's a black coach. And I wanted him to have the best possible record by the time he leaves out of all the coaches. But part of the reason wasn't just because I like the idea of the Springboks doing well, which is obviously what would have to be the case for him to have an amazing record. But part of it is the fact that he's black. I didn't feel the same wish for Jake or any of the other coaches. I just had a desire for the Springbok team to do well, but I had no vested interest in affirming and wishing well and having goodwill for any of those Springbok coaches. But because Pieter Key sounds, well, no one sounds like him, but a little more like my dad than the other coaches, it instantly resonated with me in terms of racial affinity and familiarity. The final story, which is on everyone's mind, still, I hope, is of course our lovely racist models, in inverted commas, over the last 2 weeks. I've been very fascinated by the racist tweet that was sent by Jessica dos Santos, who referred to a black man as a kafir. And what has fascinated me, the more I thought about that incident, was our reaction to her. Our reactions are very revealing, and I'm going to come back to this after I've told you all the stories. But I just want to describe our reaction, and then I'll start my analysis. We were incredibly ferocious, both in terms of the content of our criticism, and also in terms of the volume of our criticism. Everyone and their mother wanted to tweet the harshest possible response. And I found that fascinating. I thought, in the first instance, my first reaction to the tweets were, it's so cool. We live in a country where someone can't get away with being racist. This is what it's about. And then I realized that actually I'm not so sure. I sometimes am more cerebral than is useful for my well-being. But I questioned after 5 minutes of happiness whether I should be happy with the volume and the ferociousness of the collective social media response towards it. And I became suspicious, and my suspicion was borne out by at least two very typical responses that typify how all of us responded. The one was one of my Facebook friends who said to me when I was on my way to talk about the issue on SABC3 Talk with Nolene, and one of my Facebook friends said to me, "You must tell them, Eusebius, tell those racists that there's no place for them in this country. And explain to them what was so horrible about what they had said." So that was one response that was typical. The second response I came across at a braai on Saturday. A friend of mine invited me to his birthday braai. And of course, this was one conversation. You know, we didn't know each other. A lot of strangers were there. So a fabulous topic of the day. Let's talk about the racist model. So eventually that became the topic of conversation, to make sure there's not too many grammatical pauses, because we didn't know each other. And one guy said, "You know what? I feel sorry for that white chick. She must have really, been raised in a closed community." And everyone agreed with him that she must have been raised in a closed community. And I went home and I thought about that, and it bothered me. In fact, I mentioned it eventually. I mentioned my problems with that assumption around the braai, because the response was very quick. It was very quick to condemn her. It was very quick to describe her as an alien. And the question is, what do these stories have in common? Well, what they have in common is they are stories that are very real. They are stories of our own lives. They are things we think, even if we don't always say it. And occasionally we accidentally slip up and we say what we think. But none of what I've said is unique to me. There are thoughts that I have had in each of those 4 stories as a South African who've traveled the world, who's been to about 20 different countries, who've lived abroad, who went to what on paper should be a multicultural melting pot, a Model C school in Grahamstown, who have friends who are black, white, Indian, colored, Afrikaans speaking, English speaking, Xhosa speaking. Those are my thoughts. I'm supposed to be the poster boy for the first generation of coconuts who are meant to be integrated multicultural guinea pigs. And those are my thoughts. I refuse to believe that those stories are atypical, that I'm an exception. I insist that those stories are prototypical rather than exceptional. And there's a couple of conclusions I want to draw about our collective headspace when it comes to issues of race that each of those stories typify. The first thing those stories typify is that racial identity still runs deep, even though we deny it. As a matter of descriptive fact, leave aside normative or principal questions about whether that's a good or a bad thing. Just as a matter of empirical psychological fact, racial identities run deep, and we don't acknowledge that they do. We're so scared of acknowledging them that we deny that truth, even in contexts where the racial affinity is actually quite innocuous. So for example, one of my passions as a debate coach is to work with black second language or non-mother tongue speakers so that they can excel at debating. I don't think there's anything noxious about my preoccupation with black excellence when it comes to high school debating. And yet, many of us wouldn't even acknowledge that kind of innocuous racial motivation because we are too scared to be open about the depth of our racial affinities that we have. Even when it comes to examples where those racial affinities are not necessarily the basis of racial prejudice or objectionable racial discrimination. If I choose to spend 200 hours working only with black kids in high schools around Joburg who are struggling to be able to do well at debating, and my motivation in part is the fact that they are black, I don't regard that as poisonous, as a source of motivation. But even that kind of racial affinity we deny because we're too scared to own up to the depth of our own racial affinities. And I think we've got to accept as a starting point that racial affinity runs very deep in South Africa. And the stories that I share with you bear that out very typically. My response to the black woman who's having this brawl with an Indian woman stems from racial affinity. That's perhaps a slightly more poisonous example than what motivates me as a debate coach. But I've got to acknowledge that I have that affinity. The fact that I want the black speaker at the Oxford Union to do well is a reflection of how much race is part of my self-identity. And I can't run away from that. And I think in South Africa we are in denial about the depth of racial affinities that all of us experience in varying degrees. And we mask that denial by doing things that make us feel as if we have transcended it, even though we haven't. So if you're going on a camp or you're part of a student society that has different race groups represented in it, it makes you think that all is well. I can't possibly have racial affinities. I'm part of the debating society and we look like the picture of Tommy Hilfiger. Well, no nonsense. Because if you poke enough and you come up with the right context in which to do an acid test of how deep your non-racialism is, racial affinities always lurk around the corner, but we don't have the space in South Africa to be honest about it because we've been told that racial affinities are bad. And if we can't acknowledge that racial affinities exist, we don't have a fighting chance of dealing with racial affinities' problematic cousin, racism. That for me is the first conclusion out of these stories. The second is that we are in denial about the scope of the problem. This is what I meant when I was alluding to I've got a problem with our reaction to Jessica dos Santos. I've got zero sympathy for the fact that we clamped down on her. She deserved that. So I certainly would not make a defense of her racism, nor the fact that she was ostracized on social media platforms and had commercial consequences for her career. That was appropriate. She deserved that. But we were too quick That person at the bride, my friend's house, convinced himself, and everyone agreed with him, that Jessica grew up in an attic. She's different. She's an alien. She's not like us. Feel sorry for her. She comes from a community that's so incredibly insular. No wonder she doesn't know what to do now that her modeling career has taken her to this amazing multiracial nirvana that she can't handle. Well, no bullshit. Jessica is in the audience. Jessica is in our house. Jessica is you and me. But we convince ourselves that the scope of the problem is small. And so by throwing the first stone and throwing the biggest possible stone and making big noise about it on social media platform, it's an attempt to say, I'm not her, I'm unlike her. I couldn't have been her. I don't know her. She comes from a community that is close-knit. Go onto the TV set, Eusebius, and tell them we don't want them in our midst. Well, how many of us who tweeted that kind of ferocious response owned up to our own racial baggage? We didn't, because we are hoping that by pointing towards her as an exception that we all hate, it can deflect attention from ourselves. We don't have to do soul searching. I mean, if I send 10 tweets saying that she's a racist bastard who should have a title taken away, then I must be the online face of racial justice. That, I think, it's dangerous because it makes it seem as if the problem is small, and it makes it seem as if our racial challenges are out there rather than inside the cinema. And I realized that that is what underpinned my discomfort with our responses. It's not that our responses were morally inappropriate as a form of sanction against their behavior, but it is that part of our response is actually a way of masking having to assess our own lives. To that extent, I think we should be careful not to pat ourselves over the back for having quickly clamped down on that kind of racist tweet, because the swiftness with which we did and the ferocity with which we did is actually very suspicious. It's a little bit like having Gareth Cliff arrested for drunken driving and then sending out 10 tweets saying, this guy is irresponsible. Well, thousands of South Africans drive over the limit all the time, including a good number of those who send out the tweets condemning the person that gets busted. The truth is, the difference between Jessica and us is that she got busted. The difference is not that she is the racist and you and I are the poster kids for non-racialism. That's not the case. And so that really is, for me, the second big thought that I want to put for discussion, that we need to own up to, and I don't think we sufficiently do, to the scope of the problem. So we get two types of unhealthy responses to these conversations. You get those South Africans who would like to pretend that the problem doesn't exist. It's now about class, it's now about culture, it's not about race. Or you get the South African who says, we do have a racism problem, but you see, don't talk about it so much. You make it seem like a big issue. There are actually just 3 races in the country, otherwise we're okay. Okay? That's also unhealthy. Not only is it a lie to say there's no problem, it's also a lie to pretend that the scope of the problem is actually quite minute and that we have amazingly carefully and steadily marched towards a non-racial South Africa. We definitely have not done that. Let me close for a couple of minutes by just talking about the political discourse in the country in relation to what I've said. I haven't put on the table, because it's not my aim, solutions, and maybe we'll talk about this. I've deliberately not talked about, I'm leaving the stories hanging and the points that I've made hanging for a very deliberate reason. I have spoken to enough South African communities to realize that we're not on the same page on the question of whether there is a problem and what the scope of the problem is, and whether the problem is out there or whether the problem includes our own domestic and institutional spaces. We can't talk about the solution space if we haven't agreed on the diagnostic of where we are at. And in a weird way, another form of deflecting attention from ourselves is to say, let's talk about the problem, the solution, Eusebius. So what should we do about it? We can't be too quick in talking about the solution space. We can talk about the solution space tomorrow. The reality is that we are not comfortable enough to own up to the nature, the existence, and the scope of the problem. And that's the aim of certainly that chapter in my book. I'm in no rush to talk about what the appropriate interventions are, because I'm not convinced that the majority of South Africans have yet owned up to the existence, the nature, and the scope of the race relations challenge that we have. And there is a kind of self-deception involved in rushing to the solution space, because it's very uncomfortable to talk about the existence, the nature, and the scope of the problem. So I'm deliberately only talking about that. In terms of our political discourse on race, the way race plays out in our public political debate and within the parties within the country are very disappointing ways in which they play out. And that is because a point that I made earlier today with some students on the lawn, the relationship between domestic space and public political space have not been very well understood in South Africa. If things, to put it most simply, are not going well at home, it's not going to go well at the office. If they're not going well at home, it's not going to go well in Parliament. And so each of our major parties, let's take the DA and the ANC, handle the question of race destructively, opportunistically, unhealthily, in part because politicians are South Africans and not just politicians. And if we haven't dealt with these issues domestically and privately, then of course it's unsurprising that it will manifest itself clumsily within the political arena. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. If we take the DA, for example, I mean, frankly, the DA has a fantastic affirmative action program. They'll never call it that because they don't have the guts to own up to the fact that they are racially aware. They actually do themselves a disservice. They're doing good work. I refuse to believe that a white Lindiwe Mazibuko could have become parliamentary leader. The tiebreaker is that Lindiwe was black. There's no way in hell Musi Maimane, if he had a white doppelganger, the white doppelganger would have been their mayoral candidate in the local elections for Joburg. Nonsense. The response would have been, Joe Soap, you amazingly smart, articulate, great academic record so far, but dude, you haven't lived in the trenches of council politics at the local level. You're not ready to understand committee work. You're not ready to lead the caucus at a local level. It takes years of experience. Go park there as a normal councillor, and then maybe the next local elections, you'll be our man, but we're excited about your potential, and let's nurture you. That would have been the response to a talented white version of Musi Maimane. But he was catapulted because he's black. The same with Lindiwe. Lindiwe is hugely talented, incredibly sharp, and I think she's an exciting politician to watch. But her meteoric rise is fundamentally related to her being black. The DA would be deeply embarrassed and probably deny what I've said, or any of their student leaders who are in the audience. But that's not because I'm talking nonsense. I know the DA well. I'm friends and acquainted with many of the MPs. It's a party I spend more time trying to understand than any political analyst in the country is. I take them seriously. They are not in a position to own up to their racial baggage because they are no more South African than you and I. John Moody is a decent Gauteng leader, but the truth is that Ian Ollis is excellent. The tiebreaker between Ian and John is that Ian is white. If Ian was also Indian, he might still have lost, but the margin would not have been as big as it was. You might be able to explain the loss as relatively normal if the margin was small, but the gap between them in terms of the votes they got is far bigger than the competence difference between them. The only way you can explain it is the desperation for Gauteng in 2014 to be led by a non-white person. The funny thing is, I think that's okay. I think that's a party that's in touch with how race plays out in the electorate. But they are so nervous to speak about it as plainly as I've just done, because we don't live in a social space in our homes, university campuses, where we can talk freely about racial identity. So you can't have the political party showing that it wants to respond to the vacuum of leadership within itself, in terms of black African leadership, by deliberately courting excellent black people and catapulting them. They can't own up to that because they are in the same grip of denial as we are when we are lampooning Jessica on social media sites. So you can see how the clumsiness of how race is being handled inside the DA is no different to our own clumsiness when we hope to throw the first stone to deflect attention away from our own personal discomfort. The ANC, by the way, is no different. In their case, it's slightly more aggressive. They deliberately exploit these latent racial tensions that none of us speak about socially for their own political ends. And there are millions of examples one can use. You can see it in the black-on-black racism in terms of how they respond to Lindiwe as a politician. I mean, Blade Nzimande's feeble attempt to lampoon her having a private school or Model C school background was a classic example of how they were trying to exploit in a very latent way certain racial prejudices that we all have, and in that case mixing it up with a class prejudice as well, notwithstanding the fact that he himself is a very well-educated person who's middle class. But obviously he was hoping that accent can become a proxy for a quick win amongst his own supporters. And you could see the same a couple of days ago in Kosatu's response to Helen Zille with the march on Kosatu House. If you had seen some of those banners, the amount of racial absolute nonsense that became the basis of responding to the DA is the hallmark of noxious racial politics on the part of tripartite alliance leaders and of their members. Placards saying things like, Zille, go to hell, go to verwoerd. That's not a mere political response. That's clearly an attempt to whip up black memory of white oppression. That's what that allusion to verwoerd was meant to evoke in a black person who sees that placard. That is a noxious use of racial identity and memories of anti-black racism for quick political gain on an issue where, frankly, they could have engaged them on the merits of the mechanism, on the ideological issues. They could have critiqued the DA's broader commitment or not to the unemployed. But what do? They use racial baiting as one way of trying to blunt the legitimacy of the DA on that occasion. And so I think where it leaves us is in a horrible state. It means that in our personal lives, as per my stories, we are often in denial, we're often clumsy, we don't acknowledge the nature, the scope of the problem, or even the existence of the problem. And in our political landscape, we see those issues being reflected. And our political leaders, unfortunately, are not particularly gifted and emotionally mature enough to lead us into that conversation. We also see it, I won't say much about this, maybe in the discussion, we see the same within the media. Even our media managers, journalists, talk show hosts are not very perceptive and sensitive in having these conversations. And sadly, in the newsrooms in Joburg, you see how this gets played out as well, in very latent sort of ways. If you want to get published in Business Day, I can give you tips for what kinds of positions are more likely to get you published there from a race discourse point of view. Only two columnists in Business Day who write stuff that goes against the grain of otherwise what would go are Stephen Friedman and Aubrey Machikri. But besides them, there's a dominant discourse there of affirming white fear. The worst offender is Built as a newspaper, which reflects back to its readers their own racial fears. As I was saying to Matt earlier, your best chance of being on the front page of Built is to be white, blonde, 5, and dead. Because that affirms the sense of we are living under a lager. That feeds on and affirms irrational racial convictions that we have. So the media are culprits, our political leaders are culprits, and I'm afraid we are culprits too in terms of denying this reality. And if we can't talk about the existence of these challenges, I'm not interested in talking about solutions when in fact there isn't a shared understanding of the reality of the problem. Thanks.